0200 hours arrived quietly, the kind of hour when wars only seem to sleep. The flight line lay half-lit and still, UH-1 Huey helicopters resting in neat rows after another day of relentless flying. Inside the operations shack, night staff worked on habit alone, shuffling paperwork and nursing cups of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Nothing about this moment suggested that history was about to break formation. If you want more stories like this, where real decisions, not Hollywood myths, decide who lives and who doesn't, this is the kind of history worth staying for. Captain Jason Rhee of the 101st Airborne was midway through his third cup when he felt it before he heard it. A vibration through the concrete, then a rising whine. Turbine engines spooling up on the flight line. Rhee looked instinctively toward the radio, waiting for the routine call signs, the clipped authorization codes. Nothing came. The radio stayed silent. No clearance. No warning. Just the unmistakable sound of Hueys coming alive. At a major U.S. airbase in a combat zone that simply did not happen. Helicopters did not move without paperwork, approval chains, and logged authorization. Not at Bien Hoa, not at 0200 hours. Rhee was already running. He burst onto the tarmac as two UH-1 Hueys lifted cleanly into the night, navigation lights blinking as they banked northwest. Two empty pads stared back at him where millions of dollars worth of aircraft had been moments earlier. The chain-link barrier, protecting the quick-reaction birds, hung open. On the ground lay a padlock, sliced clean through. No brute force, no damage. A precise cut. The duty sergeant arrived seconds later, a veteran who had seen Korea, Laos, and Khe Sanh. He took in the empty flight line, the fading lights, and the severed lock. Then he shrugged. In Vietnam, some questions came with answers you didn't want. Those helicopters were heading toward the Cambodian border, toward terrain officially labeled unstable, contested, and unforgiving. Whoever was flying them had not asked permission, and whoever had authorized it, on paper, did not exist. What no one at Bien Hoa could know yet was that 40 kilometers away, 6 Australian SAS soldiers were trapped inside a rubber plantation that had turned into a killing ground. Their emergency extraction request had already been denied. Not once, but repeatedly. Too risky. Assets unavailable. Higher priorities elsewhere. The system had made its decision. And somewhere between that decision and the vanishing navigation lights, someone else had decided that the system was wrong. To understand why 2 American helicopters would lift off without permission that night, it is necessary to understand the men they were flying to, and the way those men fought a very different war. By 1970, Australian forces in Vietnam had developed a reputation that made American planners uneasy, not because they were ineffective, but because they were effective in ways that did not fit established doctrine. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment operated on principles shaped long before Vietnam, drawn from British commando traditions, refined during the Malayan emergency, and adapted to jungle warfare through techniques influenced by Aboriginal tracking practices. Their approach emphasized patience, silence, and psychological dominance rather than mass and firepower. Where American units often conducted large-scale search and destroy operations supported by artillery and airstrikes, Australian SAS patrols typically moved in teams of 5 or 6 men. They traveled light, avoided contact whenever possible, and stayed in the field for days or weeks at a time. They carried their water. They buried all waste. They communicated without radios unless absolutely necessary. A well-trained Australian patrol could pass within meters of an enemy position without being detected, and often did. The results were difficult to argue with. In Phouok Tuy province, Australian SAS patrols achieved casualty ratios that far exceeded those of larger Allied formations operating in the same terrain. American analysts initially questioned the figures, suspecting inflated reports. When observers were embedded to verify the claims, they discovered something more uncomfortable. The Australians were not playing the same game. They were fighting a war of erosion rather than domination. Intelligence collection mattered more than body counts. Fear mattered more than territory. The Australians understood that the enemy's greatest strength was not weapons or numbers, but the psychological infrastructure that allowed guerrilla forces to survive among the population. Their response was precise, deliberate, and deeply unsettling to outside observers. Sergeant David Mitchell embodied this philosophy. A former Brisbane dock worker, he approached soldiering the way a tradesman approached a problem. Identify what needs to be done, use whatever tools are available, and do not waste time asking for permission when lives are at stake. By his second tour, Mitchell had gained a reputation for flawless fieldcraft and a complete disregard for bureaucratic obstruction. American commanders respected Australian professionalism, but they struggled with Australian independence. The US military system was built on scale, hierarchy, and process. The Australian system, particularly within the SAS, was built on trust, autonomy, and individual judgment. Both systems could win battles. But when systems collided, friction was inevitable. By July 1970, that friction had been building for years. And when the system failed 6 men trapped in the jungle, it was the Australian way of war, not American doctrine, that would decide what happened next. Patrol Whiskey 24 inserted into the Thuan Duke rubber plantation on the night of July 17, 1970. The mission was routine by SAS standards. Confirm intelligence suggesting North Vietnamese Army regulars were using the plantation's processing facilities as a logistics cache, an improvised field hospital. The terrain was deceptively orderly. Long, geometric rows of rubber trees, clear lines of sight, and well-worn paths that promised ease of movement while hiding some of the most lethal booby traps in the province. The patrol moved exactly as they had been trained to. They avoided cleared tracks, advanced along irregular routes, and halted for long periods to listen. Over the next 48 hours, Whiskey 24 gathered intelligence of exceptional value. They observed supply movements at night, identified defensive positions, and intercepted radio traffic indicating that NVA elements were staging for a larger operation. By the afternoon of July 19th, Patrol Commander Corporal Peter Hayes had more than enough material to justify immediate extraction. Hayes requested pickup through standard channels. The reply came back quickly and unfavorably. All available aviation assets were committed to a major American operation unfolding to the north. The patrol was instructed to find a hide position and wait up to 48 hours. Under normal circumstances, this would have been survivable. The patrol had sufficient rations. Their position had not yet been compromised. But the jungle does not respect schedules. At 17:32 hours, Private Stephen Walsh triggered a pressure plate detonator that had not been present during the patrol's earlier movement. The explosion was small but devastating. His right leg was shattered below the knee. Corporal James Thornton applied a tourniquet within seconds, stopping the bleeding. but the damage was catastrophic. Walsh needed surgery within hours. In the jungle, delay meant infection. Infection meant amputation, or worse. Hayes upgraded the extraction request to emergency medevac. What followed was a sequence of responses that would later define the incident. Assets unavailable. Airspace saturated. Higher priority operations ongoing. Medical advice could be provided by radio. The patrol's situation deteriorated rapidly. The explosion had compromised their concealment. By nightfall, NVA forces were maneuvering toward their position, probing with small arms fire and attempting to fix the Australians in place. Whiskey 24 was pinned against a drainage ditch, defending from 3 directions while trying to keep Walsh alive. Hayes requested artillery support. The target was deemed too close to civilian structures. He requested air support. None available. He requested permission to move to an alternate extraction zone. Denied. Hold position. Extraction may become available in 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours was not a plan. It was a sentence. As darkness closed in and enemy pressure increased, Whiskey 24 prepared for the reality Australian patrols trained for but hoped never to face, fighting their way out with a critically wounded man and no guarantee of survival. What they did not know was that the denial of their extraction had already triggered a response, one that existed entirely outside the system that had just failed them. When the emergency update from Whiskey 24 reached Australian headquarters at Nui Dat, it passed through layers of approval exactly as procedure required, and exactly as procedure allowed, it stalled. The patrol's request was technically approved at the Australian level, but Australian commanders did not control the helicopters operating in that sector. American aviation units did, and the American response was final. Sergeant David Mitchell read the message shortly after 18-20 hours. There was nothing emotional about his reaction. No outburst, no argument. He simply stepped outside the operations building, lit a cigarette, and began working through the problem the way he always did. The patrol needed helicopters. Australian helicopters were unavailable. American helicopters were available, but withheld. That meant the problem was not logistics. It was access. Mitchell understood Bien Hoa Air Base better than most Australians had any right to. He had been there on liaison visits, briefings, and coordination meetings. He knew the flight line layout, the security routines, and the location of the quick reaction aircraft kept fueled and armed for emergencies. He also knew that American base security was designed to stop Viet Cong infiltrators, not Allied personnel carrying valid identification and behaving as if they belonged. Within an hour, Mitchell had assembled what he needed. He contacted Warrant Officer Kevin O'Brien, an Australian Army aviation pilot he trusted implicitly. The conversation was brief. There was no formal request, no explanation of consequences. O'Brien understood the implication immediately. A patrol was in trouble. Time mattered more than orders. The final piece was American. Sergeant First Class William Patterson, a U.S. Army Huey pilot on liaison duty, had flown enough missions to know what assets unavailable often meant. Mitchell found him eating in the mess and spoke plainly. An Allied patrol was pinned down. A man was losing his leg. 2 helicopters could change that. Patterson asked one question: how fast? Just after 2100 hours, Mitchell drove the 3 of them toward Bien Hoa in a commandeered Land Rover, using authorization codes he was not officially supposed to possess. They passed through the front gate without incident. Allied credentials. Routine visit. No alarms. On the flight line, the conditions were exactly as Mitchell had predicted. Minimal staffing, poor lighting, institutional complacency. Two UH-1 Hueys sat on the quick reaction pad, fueled, armed, and unattended. The chain barrier was secured with standard-issue padlocks. Mitchell cut them cleanly, using tools he carried for precisely this kind of moment. Patterson and O'Brien moved with professional speed. Pre-flight checks were abbreviated. Engines spooled up. Rotor blades began to turn. For a moment, the noise seemed impossibly loud, but no one came running. When the tower radio finally crackled, questioning the unauthorized activity, Mitchell responded in the calm monotone of a logistics officer, issuing an authorization code that did not exist and did not need to. By the time the controller could challenge it, both helicopters were airborne. At 22:15 hours, two American Hueys lifted off from Bien Hoa without permission, without paperwork, and without any intention of turning back. They turned northwest, flying low and fast toward a rubber plantation where 6 men were still fighting for time. By the time the helicopters crossed into the Thuan Duc area, the situation on the ground had reached its breaking point. Patrol Whiskey 24 was no longer attempting to disengage. They were fighting to hold space. North Vietnamese forces had tightened their cordon, firing from 3 directions and testing the Australians' perimeter with short, aggressive probes. The drainage ditch that offered limited cover was rapidly becoming a trap. Private Stephen Walsh was drifting in and out of consciousness. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but shock was setting in. Corporal James Thornton knew the signs. Without surgical intervention, Walsh's leg, and possibly his life, were measured in hours, not days. At 22:48 hours, Corporal Peter Hayes heard a sound that should not have been there. The distinct rising thump of helicopter rotors approaching from the southeast. No call sign had been passed. No confirmation had been received. Hayes transmitted blind on the emergency frequency, not knowing whether anyone was listening. The reply came immediately. The voice was American. Calm, direct. The aircraft were inbound. 2 helicopters, fully armed. 0 authorization. Hayes deployed smoke and began the extraction drill without hesitation. Questions could wait. Survival could not. The first Huey descended aggressively, flaring hard over the drainage ditch as door gunners opened fire to suppress enemy positions. Hayes lifted Walsh and ran, bullets snapping through the trees as he reached the open door. The wounded soldier was pulled aboard as the aircraft settled only long enough to take weight. The second helicopter touched down meters away. Thornton, Chen, Mloud, and Walsh's covering element boarded under fire, following shouted instructions from the cockpit. The aircraft were on the ground for 37 seconds. 37 seconds to undo hours of denial. As the helicopters lifted away, tracer fire chased them into the night. One round struck the tail boom of the lead aircraft, causing damage but no loss of control. The pilots stayed low, fast, and silent, flying a route designed to avoid radar and attention. The extraction was complete. The aftermath unfolded in silence and paperwork. The helicopters were returned within hours. The incident report was rewritten. Names were removed. Classifications applied. No charges were filed. No commendations publicly issued. Private Stephen Walsh arrived at surgical care with minutes to spare. He kept his leg. Officially, the extraction was routine. Unofficially, it became legend. Within special operations circles, the story spread, not as an act of defiance, but as a case study in judgment. When systems fail, when time runs out, when doing nothing becomes the most dangerous choice of all. The helicopters had been American. The decision had been Australian. And 6 men went home alive because someone chose action over permission.